She threw the phone at the wall so hard the screen shattered on contact. That was the moment Ara Quinn understood she was already dead. She just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The text had come at 2:14 in the morning, a photograph of her standing at the outdoor market 3 blocks from the estate, taken from behind, zoomed tight enough to catch the small scar along her left jaw. Below the image, 4 words. "We found you, Eleanor." Eleanor. The name she'd buried 4 years ago in a gas station bathroom outside Reno with a pair of scissors and a box of drugstore hair dye. Someone had dug it back up. If you've ever had to disappear, if you've ever looked over your shoulder for so long your neck stopped hurting because the fear just became your body's new resting state, then you already know exactly what Ara felt in that moment. And if you haven't, ask yourself, what would you do if the life you'd built with your bare hands started collapsing at 2 a.m.? Before we go further, if stories like this one reach something real inside you, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it started. The estate sat on 43 acres outside the city, far enough from anything resembling civilization that the only sounds at night were wind through the cedar trees and the occasional crunch of gravel when one of the security rotation vehicles made its pass along the perimeter road. Ara had taken the job 8 months earlier under the name she'd constructed, carefully, patiently, after the 3rd time she'd moved cities in 18 months. Her references were clean. Her social security number belonged to a real woman who had died in a car accident in 2019 and had no living relatives to notice the identity walking around. That wasn't something Ara was proud of. She'd told herself it was temporary. She was still telling herself that. The job listing had described the position as private estate chef for a single-occupant household with occasional guest service requirements. It had not mentioned that the household was owned by Darian Voss, which Ara only discovered during the background interview with his head of security, a compact, gray-haired man named Marcus Priel, who had the steady eyes of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where lying was a survival skill. "You know who you'd be cooking for," Marcus had said. It wasn't a question. "I recognize the address," Ara had answered. "Most applicants dropped out when they did." "I'm not most applicants." Marcus had studied her for a long moment. Then he'd written something on his notepad, she never found out what, and told her she'd hear from them within 48 hours. She'd heard back in 6. She still wasn't sure what that meant about her or about them. Darian Voss was 41, the kind of rich that didn't need to perform itself, with a reputation built across 3 decades of financial restructuring deals that his critics called predatory and his attorneys called creative. He had enemies the way other men had hobbies, steadily, enthusiastically, and without apparent concern for the accumulation. He was not warm, he was not approachable. He moved through his own house like a man calculating distances, always aware of where the exits were. Ara understood that impulse better than most. In 8 months of working in his kitchen, they had exchanged perhaps 200 words. He came down early, sometimes 4:30, sometimes 5, and stood at the kitchen island with his coffee while she prepped the morning, and occasionally he asked a question about what she was making or commented on something he'd eaten the night before. He was precise with his observations, not complimentary, not critical, precise. He said things like the fennel was more pronounced last time, or the texture on the bread this morning was better than Tuesday's. She had started to look forward to those brief, odd assessments, the way you look forward to something you won't let yourself admit you look forward to. That was the danger of staying too long anywhere. You started to have things you'd miss. She'd known for 3 weeks that something was wrong before the photograph arrived. The first sign had been the car, a gray sedan parked along the access road, not on the estate grounds, on the public road that ran alongside the eastern boundary, for 2 days in a row in the same spot. She'd mentioned it to Marcus, who'd sent one of his men to check the plates and found a rental with documentation that led to a shell company with a registered address in Nevada that turned out to be a mailbox store. Marcus had not told her this directly. She'd overheard it through the kitchen window when he was on the phone outside. She hadn't corrected him about her eavesdropping. She'd simply begun mentally cataloging exits again, something she'd gotten out of the habit of doing and was angry at herself for having let slip. The second sign had been a phone call. Her cell number, the prepaid one she'd had for 6 months, had received a call from a blocked number at 11:15 on a Tuesday night. She hadn't answered. The voicemail had been 11 seconds of silence and then a hang-up. Not a pocket dial. Deliberate silence. She'd bought a new phone the next morning and told herself it was nothing. The third sign had been the camera. She'd found it while doing something as ordinary as changing a light bulb in the utility hallway near the kitchen entrance. A small device, no bigger than a fingertip, tucked into the bracket where the smoke detector mounted to the wall. Not a Voss estate camera. She knew where all of those were. Marcus had given her the full security orientation during her first week, the kind of thorough briefing that told her this wasn't a household where ignorance was encouraged. This camera was not on that list. She'd left it in place. Touching it meant letting them know she'd found it. She'd gone back to the kitchen, sliced onions for 40 minutes until her hands stopped shaking, and thought about what to do. She hadn't told Marcus. She hadn't told anyone. And then the photograph had come, and the choice about whether to handle this quietly had been made for her. Ara sat on the edge of her bed. The small room at the east end of the estate that she'd made almost habitable with a second-hand reading lamp and a few paperbacks she'd picked up at a thrift store, and pressed her palms flat against her thighs. Her breath was controlled. She'd practiced controlled breathing the way other people practiced yoga, not for wellness, but because panic was a liability she couldn't afford. She thought about the night 4 years ago that had made her Eleanor Park, and before that had made her Ara Quinn, and before that had made her the kind of person who understood exactly what happened to witnesses who talked too much. She had been 28. She'd been working the service line at a high-end catering company, the kind that did corporate events and charity galas for people whose names appeared in the business section. One of those events had been a fundraiser at a private venue, an event she'd later learn was a front, the kind of gathering where serious men talked about serious things behind the cover of expensive wine and a guest list full of names no prosecutor would want to subpoena. She hadn't understood what she was seeing at first. It had looked like a business meeting. 2 men in a back hallway, a transfer of a folder, a short conversation. She'd been carrying a tray of champagne flutes and had stopped to avoid walking into them. She'd stood around the corner for 45 seconds while they finished talking. 45 seconds. That was all it had taken to end her life as she'd known it. The man doing the talking had been Victor Crane. She hadn't known his name then. She'd learned it 6 months later from a federal contact who had tracked her down and told her, very quietly, over coffee in a diner on the outskirts of Sacramento, that what she had overheard constituted the only first-hand witness account of a directive given to move a specific group of trafficking victims across a federal boundary. A directive given by Crane personally to a man named Desmond Holtz, who had since disappeared. The federal agent's name was Sandra Merritt. She'd seemed solid. She'd seemed trustworthy. Ara had believed her. Then Sandra Merritt had been transferred, reassigned, and quietly removed from the case within 30 days of their meeting. And 3 weeks after that, 2 men Ara didn't recognize had shown up at her apartment building, and she'd seen them from her car before she'd gotten to the front door, and she'd kept driving. She hadn't stopped for 9 hours. 4 years. 3 cities. 2 identities. One consistent, grinding fear that had started to soften only in the last 8 months, which told her something about human psychology, about how quickly the body wanted to believe the danger had passed, even when the mind knew better. The mind had been right. The body had been wrong. And now here she was, sitting on the edge of a bed at 2:15 in the morning with a shattered phone on the floor and 4 words echoing in her skull. "We found you, Eleanor." She thought about running. She was good at running. She'd had practice. She could be packed in 11 minutes. She'd timed herself. She could take the car she'd parked herself in the secondary lot, drive to the bus station 40 minutes away, pay cash, and be 3 states removed by morning. She sat there for a long time not moving. Something had changed. She didn't fully understand it yet, but something had shifted in the calculus she'd been running for 4 years. Maybe it was exhaustion. The specific bone-deep exhaustion of a person who has been afraid for too long and has simply run low on the fuel that fear requires. Maybe it was something else. Something to do with the 43 acres outside her window and the cedar trees and the man downstairs who assessed the texture of her bread with the same seriousness he applied to apparently everything else. She picked up the pieces of her shattered phone. She set them on the nightstand. She lay back on the bed with her clothes still on and stared at the ceiling until the light outside the window began to shift from black to the particular deep blue that preceded dawn. At 4:45, she heard the sound she recognized, the faint click of the kitchen light, the soft mechanical exhale of the espresso machine. He was up early. She made a decision then. Not the running decision. The other one. She got up, straightened her shirt, and went downstairs. Darian was standing at the island with his back to her when she came through the kitchen door. He didn't turn, but he spoke. "You're up early." "I didn't sleep." "The bread dough can wait." "It's not about the bread." That made him turn. He studied her the way he studied everything, steadily, without performance. He took in the wrinkled clothes, the shadows under her eyes, the particular quality of stillness that she wore when she was holding something difficult very carefully. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." "Ara." She hadn't heard him use her first name before. It landed differently than she expected. "Someone put a camera in your house," she said. "Utility hallway, east end, smoke detector bracket. It's not yours. I found it 3 days ago, and I didn't report it because I wasn't sure who the threat was, and I needed to think." He didn't move. His coffee mug was suspended halfway between the counter and his mouth, and he set it down without completing the motion. "And tonight?" he said. She told him about the photograph, about the name on the text, about the gray sedan and the phone call and the 11 seconds of deliberate silence. She told him more than she'd intended to. She'd planned to give him the minimum necessary, the surveillance details, the threat assessment, the recommendation that she vacate the premises for his own security. Instead, she heard herself talking about Sandra Merritt and the diner outside Sacramento and the apartment building and the 9-hour drive and the box of drugstore hair dye in a gas station bathroom. She hadn't told anyone any of this in 4 years. When she stopped talking, the kitchen was very quiet. The espresso machine made a small, settling sound. Outside, the sky had moved from deep blue to the first thin gray of early morning. Darian had not interrupted her once. "Victor Crane," he said. "Yes." "I know that name." Something cold moved through her. "How?" He picked up his coffee mug, set it back down without drinking. "Not the way you're thinking. Sit down, Ara, please." She sat, because please from him sounded like something he didn't say often and meant every time. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, "and you're not going to like it." She looked at him across the kitchen island in the gray early morning light, and she thought, with the specific clarity that comes from being very tired and very afraid, and finally, at last, having run out of road, that whatever came next was going to change everything. She'd been right about that before. The question was whether she could survive being right again. 3 years ago, Darian said, Crane's organization tried to acquire a logistics company I was restructuring. Shell acquisition. The kind that looks clean on paper until you pull the third layer of holding entities and find something that shouldn't be there. What did you find? Movement records. Not product. People. He said it flat. No dramatization. I killed the deal. Reported it through a private channel. Someone I trusted in the financial crimes division. 6 weeks later, that person was transferred to a posting in another country and the report disappeared. Ara was very still. I kept copies, Darian said. Why are you telling me this now? Because you just told me Victor Crane has people inside my house, which means this stopped being historical the moment you sat down. He finally drank his coffee. How long has he known where you are? The camera's been there at least 2 weeks, maybe longer. Which means the photograph last night wasn't a warning. No, she said. It was a countdown. Darian set the mug down. He moved to the door of the kitchen and called a name. Not loud, the way you'd call into a quiet house that had people already awake in it. Marcus appeared from the hallway within 40 seconds, which told Ara the head of security kept early hours by choice, not schedule. Marcus looked at her first. then at Darian. "We have a situation," Darian said. "Get Reyes and come back." Marcus left without asking a single question. Ara watched the empty doorway. "You trust him completely?" she asked. "He's the only person in this building I trust completely." "That's a short list." "It's the right length." Reyes turned out to be a woman, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, the kind of physical composure that suggested extensive training rather than natural ease. She and Marcus reappeared in under 4 minutes. Darian walked them through what Ara had told him in precise, sequential order, the way he apparently did everything, without editorializing or emphasis. Just the facts in the order they happened. When he finished, Marcus looked at Ara with an expression that wasn't quite apology and wasn't quite accusation. Somewhere between. "The camera in the utility hallway," he said. "You found it 3 days ago." "Yes." "And you didn't come to me?" "No." A pause. "Why?" She met his eyes. "Because I didn't know yet if the threat was outside the house or inside it." Something shifted in Marcus's expression. Not offense, recognition. He'd operated in that same kind of uncertainty before. She could see it in the way the tension left his jaw. "Fair," he said quietly. Reyes had already pulled out a tablet. "I need the exact location of the device, and I need you to walk me through every interaction, every vehicle, every call you flagged in the last 30 days, in order." They worked for 2 hours at the kitchen table. By the time the sky outside had gone from gray to pale gold, they had a partial picture that was coherent enough to be frightening. The sedan had returned. Reyes had pulled footage from a camera on the estate's boundary road, one Ara hadn't known existed, and found 3 distinct vehicles rotating the surveillance position over 17 days. Professional rotation, not amateurs. The hidden camera in the utility hallway had a transmission range consistent with a receiver vehicle parked within a quarter mile. They had been watching her schedule, her movements through the house, the time she left, the time she returned. "They're not ready to move yet," Marcus said, looking at the footage timestamps. "They're still in the information phase." "How long before that changes?" Darian asked. "Days, maybe less, depending on what triggered the text last night." "The text was an intimidation move," Reyes said. "They wanted her running. A moving target is easier to pick up than someone in a fixed, secured location." Ara thought about her 11-minute packing calculation, about the bus station 40 minutes away, about 3 states by morning. They had known exactly what she would do. They'd been counting on it. "I almost ran," she said. Not to anyone specifically, just aloud because it needed to be said. Darian looked at her from across the table. "But you didn't." "No." "Why not?" She didn't have a clean answer for that. She looked at the surface of the kitchen table, the same table where she'd prepped 1,000 meals over 8 months, where she'd stood alone at odd hours peeling garlic and pretending her life was ordinary. And she thought about why a person who was very practiced at running chose, at the exact moment running was most rational, to walk downstairs instead. "I was tired," she said finally. "Not of being afraid? I've been afraid a long time. That's just weather at this point. I was tired of being the only person who knew." Nobody spoke. 4 years of carrying what I saw in that hallway, what I heard, and Sandra Merritt was the only other person I ever told, and they moved her inside 30 days. She looked up. I needed it to exist somewhere outside my own head, even if just for one night. Darian held her gaze for a moment. Then he straightened in his chair with the particular quality of decision she was beginning to recognize in him. The slight forward shift, the settling of weight. "Then it's not just in your head anymore," he said. "Marcus, full lockdown protocol. I want the perimeter doubled by 6 a.m., and I want that camera pulled and analyzed within the hour." He paused. "Carefully. Leave it transmitting until we know what they're receiving." Marcus was already moving. Reyes closed her tablet and looked at Ara directly. "You're going to need to tell us everything, all of it. The night at the venue, what you heard, what Merritt said to you, everything." "I know." "It's going to take time." "I know that too." Ara looked out the kitchen window at the pale morning. Somewhere beyond the cedar trees, beyond the perimeter road, men in rotating vehicles were watching this house, and waiting for her to make the mistake they'd engineered her to make. She hadn't made it. For the first time in 4 years, that felt like something more than luck. The camera came down at 6:12 a.m. Reyes handled it herself, standing on a step stool in the utility hallway with a pair of nitrile gloves and a signal analyzer the size of a deck of cards. She worked without speaking. Marcus stood at the hallway entrance and watched the front of the house. Ara stood behind Reyes and watched the device come free of the smoke detector bracket. A matte black disc the diameter of a coat button, with a transmission wire so thin it looked like a strand of hair. "Military grade?" Ara asked. "Commercial," Reyes said. "But modified. Someone knew what they were doing." She dropped it into a static shielded bag and sealed it. It transmitted on a standard encrypted frequency. We'll know the receiver range within the hour. Which tells us how close they were parked. Which tells us where they were parked specifically if we cross it with the boundary footage. Ara nodded and said nothing else. She went back to the kitchen and made breakfast. Not because anyone had asked her to, but because her hands needed something to do and standing still had become unbearable. She made eggs and toast and a second pot of coffee and set it all on the island without announcement. And when Marcus and Reyes came through 20 minutes later, they ate without comment, which she appreciated more than she would have known how to say. Darian didn't eat. He stood at the far end of the island with a legal pad and wrote things in a handwriting so compressed she couldn't read it from where she stood. He'd been on 2 phone calls in the last hour, brief, clipped exchanges where he'd done more listening than talking, and both times he'd ended the call before she could catch any specifics. She noticed that. She filed it. At 7:40, Marcus set a printed satellite image on the counter between them and pointed to a gray rectangle on the access road's eastern shoulder. "That's a receiver unit," he said, disguised as a utility junction box. Telcom-style housing, green, mounted on a post that wasn't there 6 weeks ago based on the prior imagery. He tapped the image. The camera in the hallway fed directly to this. From here, data was forwarded remotely. Could be anywhere. Ara studied the image. How long has it been there? Installation marks in the ground suggest 3 to 4 weeks minimum. 3 to 4 weeks. She'd been watched for 3 to 4 weeks and had only caught the camera at week 2. Whatever they'd captured in the first week, her schedule, her movements, her blind spots, they already had. "What did they see?" she asked. Marcus hesitated. Not long, a beat, but she caught it. Marcus. They had a clear sight line down the utility hallway to the kitchen entrance. If the angle was right, they could have captured partial visibility of the main kitchen as well. So they know the layout. Some of it, yes. They know how I move through the house. Likely. She pushed back from the counter and walked to the window. The cedar trees stood motionless in the morning light. The access road was empty and quiet and completely ordinary looking. That was the thing about this kind of threat. It wore the face of ordinary. The gray sedan had looked like any gray sedan. The junction box looked like utility infrastructure. The camera had looked like part of the smoke detector. She'd spent 4 years training herself to see through ordinary. She'd gotten sloppy. "There's something else," Marcus said behind her. She turned. He didn't look at Darian. He looked at her. "The rental documentation on the first sedan. The shell company in Nevada. I ran a deeper trace this morning." He set a second sheet on the counter. Printed financial records, names highlighted in yellow. "The company is 3 layers removed from a holding entity that appears in your Victor Crane file, but the direct registration on the rental traces back to a federal contractor account." The kitchen went very quiet. "Define federal contractor," Darian said. "A private security firm with active contracts through the Department of Justice." Marcus's voice was absolutely level. "Which means whoever is running surveillance on this property has at minimum a partial footprint inside federal infrastructure." Ara heard her own breathing. 4 years ago, Sandra Merritt had been transferred and the report had disappeared. She had told herself it was bureaucratic incompetence, or cowardice, or the specific institutional reflex of organizations that protected themselves before they protected witnesses. She had not let herself believe, fully and without reservation, that the contamination went that deep. She believed it now. "Crane has people inside the DOJ," she said. "Inside or adjacent," Marcus said. "We can't confirm depth from this. But it's enough that if we report to federal authorities, we don't know who we're reporting to," Darian finished. "That's what Sandra Merritt said to me," Ara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. In the diner, before she disappeared from the case, she said the first rule was don't trust the channel, trust the person, and then they took away the person. Darian set down his legal pad. Then we need a person. I don't have one. I might. She looked at him. There's a federal prosecutor named Adele Cho, he said. She built the financial crimes case against a subsidiary of Crane's network 18 months ago. Separate track, money laundering, nothing that touched the trafficking directly. The case got suppressed before indictment. She resigned from the U.S. Attorney's Office 4 months later. She's in private practice now. He picked up his phone. I've had indirect dealings with her. She's clean. How do you know? Because Crane's people tried to buy her out before the suppression, and she didn't take it. I know because I was the one they came to first to find out her price. Ara stared at him. And you told them? She said. I told them I didn't have that kind of information, and I suggested they try a different approach. His expression was unchanging, which they did, and it didn't work. And 4 months later, she resigned anyway because the case was killed above her and she had nothing left to prosecute. That's not the same as her being clean. That's the same as her being unsuccessful. She could have taken the money. She didn't. He held her gaze. That's clean. Reyes came back into the kitchen before Ara could respond. She had her tablet out and her face had shifted into something harder. We have a problem, she said. Define problem, Marcus said. The receiver unit on the access road. I ran the transmission log from the signal analyzer. The camera in the hallway had been transmitting for 26 days. She set the tablet on the counter face up. But the last transmission was at 1:58 a.m. this morning. Nobody spoke. 16 minutes before the text came in, Ara said. Yes. Which means when they sent the photograph, they already knew she'd found the camera, Marcus said slowly. Or they knew she was awake and moving. Or, Reyes said, the camera wasn't the only one. The search took 40 minutes and covered every room Ara regularly occupied. Reyes and Marcus worked methodically, without hurry, with the signal analyzer sweeping every surface at close range. Ara walked with them because she refused to sit somewhere and wait, and because knowing was always better than not knowing, even when what you knew was bad. They found it in the reading lamp. The second-hand lamp she'd bought at a thrift store 7 months ago, the one she'd carried into the estate on her second week and plugged in on the small table by the east side window of her room. She'd bought it herself. She'd carried it in herself. She had sat under its light for 7 months reading paperbacks and telling herself she was safe. The device was in the base, behind the wiring housing, smaller than the one in the hallway, newer. Reyes looked at her over the lamp without saying anything. Ara sat down on the edge of the bed. She sat there for a moment with her hands flat on her thighs. The same position she'd been in at 2:15 in the morning before she'd made the decision to go downstairs. She thought about everything she'd done in this room in 7 months. Everything she'd said. Every phone call. Every time she'd let her guard down far enough to breathe without thinking about it first. How long? She asked. Reyes checked the analyzer. Signal profile suggests installation within the last 2 months, but we can't confirm exact. How long? Ara said again. 8 weeks. Minimum. 8 weeks of her room, 8 weeks of her voice, her movements, her unguarded moments, at the end of long days when she'd sometimes sat by the window and let herself feel something without immediately shutting it down. She stood up. Pull it. Pull it. I don't care what it tells them. Pull it. Reyes pulled it. Downstairs, Darian was on the phone when they came back through. He saw their faces and ended the call without finishing his sentence. Reyes set both devices on the kitchen counter in their static bags. Darian looked at the lamp-based bag for a long moment. Her room, Marcus said. Darian's jaw tightened. It was the first purely physical reaction she'd seen from him, and it was brief, a second, maybe less, before his face settled back to its default of controlled assessment. But she'd seen it. Cho, he said. I'm calling Cho. Wait, Ara said. Everyone looked at her. If Crane has federal infrastructure adjacent to him, your call to Cho goes through a cell network. It can be flagged. I'll use a landline routed through Darian? She used his name. It felt strange in her mouth. She'd been avoiding it. If they have someone in the DOJ, they may have Cho flagged already. Any contact from you to her lights aboard somewhere. Silence. Then what do you suggest? He asked. I go to her in person, unannounced, no call, no message, no digital trail. She looked at Marcus. Can you get me out of this property without being followed? Marcus didn't answer immediately. He was running it in his head. She could see him doing it, the way his eyes went slightly unfocused and his mouth compressed. Possibly, he said finally. There's a service exit on the northwest boundary that's not on any publicly available map of the property. We've never used it as a primary route, which means it won't be in whatever intelligence they've built on our movement patterns. He paused. But the access road monitors both entry points. They'd see a vehicle leave. Then I don't leave in a vehicle, Ara said. You'd have to walk a mile through the cedar perimeter before you hit the service road on the other side. I know how to walk a mile. Reyes made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Through surveillance coverage? In daylight? In whatever we have. What's the window before they're likely to move? Marcus and Reyes exchanged a look. That look said something she didn't fully read, not disagreement exactly. Assessment. Based on the text being a pressure move designed to force flight, Reyes said carefully, and flight not having occurred, they'll escalate. Timeline for escalation from surveillance to active extraction in a compromised target scenario is typically 24 to 72 hours, but that assumes standard operational tempo. Crane's operation isn't standard, Ara said. No, Marcus said. It's not. So give me a real number. 18 hours, he said. Maybe less. Darian had been listening to all of this without speaking. He turned to the counter, picked up his legal pad, turned back. There's something else, he said. Something I didn't say earlier. Ara looked at him. The financial crimes file I kept. The movement records, the shell acquisition documents. I've had them in a secure location for 3 years. He paused. 2 days ago, I tried to access the location remotely and found the authentication had been externally probed. Someone attempted access. The air in the kitchen changed. They know about your file? Marcus said. They know it exists. They haven't gotten in, but they're working on it. How long before they get through the authentication? Reyes asked. My security architect says the current barrier gives us between 48 and 72 hours. So our timeline, Marcus said quietly, is not just about Ara. No, Darian said. If they get my file and destroy it, the corroborating documentation for everything she witnessed disappears. Her testimony without supporting records is a witness account against a man with 30 lawyers and federal adjacency. He looked at Ara directly. We need Cho, and we need her now. Not as a safety option, as the only option. Ara stood in the kitchen where she'd made 1,000 meals and felt the geometry of the situation close around her. Not like a trap. She'd been in traps, and this was different. More like a doorway that was narrowing. Not closed yet, but narrowing fast. Then I'm going this morning, she said. I'm going with you, Darian said. No. If both of us disappear from this property, they'll know something shifted. You stay. You maintain the appearance of normal routine. I go through the northwest exit. I walk the perimeter. I get to Cho. She picked up the notepad from the counter and slid it across to him. Write me her office address. He wrote it without arguing, which surprised her. She took the paper. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. If I'm not back or in contact within 4 hours, she said, you assume it went wrong. And then? Then you take your file, you take your copies, and you find another way to burn Crane to the ground. She folded the paper. Without me. Darian held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't name. Something that sat between calculation and something older and less comfortable. 4 hours, he said. She nodded. She went upstairs to get her jacket. She moved quickly through the room that had been watched for 8 weeks without her knowledge, past the reading lamp base now sitting empty on the table, and she did not let herself feel anything about it until she was outside and moving and the cedar trees were closing around her and the cold morning air was sharp enough to focus on. Then she let herself feel it, briefly. The particular violation of knowing your most private hours had been recorded and transmitted to people who wanted you dead. She gave it 30 seconds. Then she put her head down and she walked. Behind her, the estate sat silent and ordinary looking in the morning light, and somewhere on the access road, in a vehicle she couldn't see, men were watching a property whose occupant they believed was cornered and running out of time. They were right about the time. They were wrong about which direction she was moving. She hit the service road at 8:43. 1 mile through cedar trees in morning frost with wet ground underfoot and no path. Just the tree line and her own sense of direction and the distant sound of highway traffic that she used as a compass bearing. Her boots were not made for this. Her ankles knew it. She kept moving anyway. The service road was a narrow, unmarked strip of cracked asphalt that ran parallel to the estate's northwest boundary before connecting to a county route 2 miles south. No signage, no lighting. The kind of road that existed on municipal maps, but not on anything a person would ever search for deliberately. She walked south. A truck passed her at 8:51, a contractor vehicle, ladders in the bed, driver not looking, and she kept her pace steady and her eyes forward and her hands visible, the way you moved when you needed to look like you belonged somewhere, even when everything in your body was screaming the opposite. The county route connected to a gas station at the intersection. She went inside, bought a coffee she didn't want with cash, and asked the attendant if there was a cab company that served the area. The attendant gave her a number. She used the payphone on the outside wall. She hadn't seen a working payphone in 3 years and was briefly, absurdly grateful for it, and called. The cab arrived in 19 minutes. The driver was incurious and the heater worked, and she sat in the back seat with the coffee going cold in her hands and watched the landscape move past the window and ran through everything she was about to say to a woman she'd never met. Adele Cho's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building in the financial district, the kind of address that said the practice was doing well without saying it loudly. The lobby directory listed the firm as Cho and Mercer, counsel. Ara took the elevator up without announcing herself at the front desk, which the receptionist on 14 noticed immediately. "Can I help you?" The receptionist's tone said she was already forming a judgment. "I need to see Adele Cho, now. No appointment." "Ms. Cho doesn't take walk-ins." "Tell her my name is Era Quinn. Tell her it's about Victor Crane and a suppressed DOJ case." She held the receptionist's eyes. "Tell her I'll be in the lobby for exactly 8 minutes." She went back to the elevator bank and stood. She did not sit in the waiting chairs. Sitting felt like a concession she couldn't afford. 4 minutes and 30 seconds later, the receptionist appeared. "Ms. Cho will see you." Adele Cho was 53, small-framed, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the particular posture of a person who had spent decades making themselves take up more space than their build suggested. Her office was ordered but not sterile, files on the credenza, a half-eaten sandwich on a paper plate, 3 coffee cups at different stages of emptiness. She was behind her desk when Ara came in, and she did not come around it. "Close the door," she said. Ara closed it. "Sit down." "I'll stand." Cho looked at her for a beat. "You're the one they've been looking for." It wasn't a question. Ara felt something cold move through her. "You know about me. I know there's a witness account attached to a crane operation that never made it into any official file I had access to. I know it was kept separate, deliberately, from the trafficking evidence track my case was building." She took off her reading glasses entirely and set them on the desk. "I know my case got killed, and I know why. I just couldn't prove the why." She paused. "Until possibly now." "Sit down, Ms. Quinn, please." Ara sat. What followed was 70 minutes of the most concentrated conversation of her life. Cho asked questions the way a surgeon used instruments, precisely, without wasted motion, each one opening something that the next one went deeper into. Ara answered everything. She did not hedge, did not qualify, did not protect herself with the careful omissions she'd practiced for years. She gave Cho the night at the venue, the 45 seconds in the hallway, the exact words she'd heard Victor Crane say to Desmond Holtz. She gave her Sandra Merritt and the Sacramento diner. She gave her the surveillance devices in the estate and the federal contractor shell company on the rental documentation. When she mentioned Darian's file, the movement records, the shell acquisition documents, The authentication breached 2 days ago. Cho stood up. She stood up and walked to the window and stood there with her back to the room for a long moment. They're moving to destroy the corroboration, she said. Not to Ara, to herself. That's our read, Ara said. Cho turned back. Her face had changed. Not afraid, something harder than afraid. Resolved. I need that file. I need it transferred to a secure location outside any network Crane's people have visibility into, within the next 12 hours. Can you move that fast? Cho picked up her desk phone. I have one contact left inside the federal system I trust with my career and my life. She's been waiting for something like this for 18 months. She held the receiver and looked at Ara directly. If I make this call, there's no stopping what comes next. You understand that. Ara thought about the lamp base on the table in her room, about 4 years in 3 cities and a name she'd buried in a gas station bathroom. Make the call, she said. Cho dialed. And 43 miles away, in a building Ara had never seen, a phone began to ring that would set in motion the thing Victor Crane had spent years and millions and the careers of compromised federal officials trying to prevent. The clock, for the first time in 4 years, was no longer running against her. Cho's contact called back in 11 minutes. 11 minutes was fast. Too fast, part of Ara's brain noted. The part that had spent 4 years treating speed as a warning sign rather than a reassurance. But Cho took the call standing at her window with her back to the room, speaking in a low, clipped register that Ara couldn't fully follow. And when she turned around, her face carried the specific expression of someone who had just been handed both a lifeline and a deadline simultaneously. Her name is Ruth Vallon, Cho said. She's a senior investigator with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Separate track from DOJ, different reporting chain. She's been building a parallel case on Crane's money infrastructure for 14 months without filing anything centrally because she didn't trust the central filing system. She paused. She wants a meeting. Today. All parties. Your documentation, Voss's file, your testimony. Where? Her terms. She picks the location and sends it an hour before. No exceptions. Ara thought about that. She doesn't trust digital communication. She uses a rotating series of encrypted channels and changes them weekly. She's been operating like this for over a year. Cho set the phone down. Which tells you something about what she knows regarding the contamination depth. Or it tells me she's exactly the kind of person Crane would construct as a false safe harbor. Cho looked at her steadily. That's a reasonable concern. How do you know her? She testified in a sealed proceeding related to my suppressed case. Her testimony was what confirmed for me that the suppression came from above the U.S. Attorney's Office. Not internal pressure. External. Above. She said the word with a particular weight. She put her career on record in a sealed file that may never see daylight. That's not what an asset does. Ara sat with that for a moment. Then she took out the folded paper with Darian's handwriting on it, Cho's office address, the only thing written on it, and turned it over and wrote on the blank side. I need to make a call, she said. Not from my cell, not from your office line. Cho opened her desk drawer and produced a phone Ara didn't recognize. Not a burner exactly, something more deliberate. Encrypted VoIP, untraceable to this location. Ara dialed Marcus's secondary number, not his primary, the secondary, the one he'd given her on her first week as part of the security briefing that she'd memorized and never written down. It rang twice. It's me, she said when he picked up. A beat. You're intact. Yes, I need Darian to begin the file transfer protocol, not to any federal network. Cho has a contact, Ruth Vallon, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, separate chain from DOJ. She kept her voice flat and factual. Vallon will send a secure location for a meeting within the hour. I need Darian there with the physical file copies. Not digital transfer, physical. Vallon's terms. He'll want to talk to you directly. Then put him on. Darian's voice came on in under 30 seconds. Are you safe? Not a question. A demand dressed as a question. For now, the contact is solid. Cho vouches for her, and her reasoning is sound. But we're moving fast. How's the estate? Quiet, which concerns me more than noise would. Any movement on the access road? Nothing visible. Reyes thinks they pulled back when the camera went dark, regrouping. How long before they come back in force? Reyes says we burned through half our buffer by pulling the devices. 8 hours. Maybe 6. 6 hours. Cho's contact had said today. It was 9:42 in the morning. Can you move the file without being tracked leaving the property? I can move it through the northwest exit the same way you did. On foot? I've done worse. She almost said something then, something that wasn't tactical, wasn't useful, that belonged to a different kind of conversation entirely. She didn't say it. Marcus goes with you. Reyes holds the estate. You go to the meeting location when Valen sends it. And you? I'll be there. She handed the phone back to Cho. Cho was watching her with an expression that was evaluating without being unkind. You've been running this kind of operational logic for 4 years alone, she said. It wasn't a question either. Someone had to. It shows. She picked up her own phone. I'm going to reach out to Valen and confirm the meeting. You should eat something. There's half a sandwich. I'm fine. You're running on cold coffee and adrenaline, and you're about to walk into a room with a federal investigator who will assess your credibility in the first 90 seconds. Cho pushed the paper plate toward her. Eat the sandwich. Era ate the sandwich. It was turkey and mustard and slightly stale, and it was the best thing she'd tasted in 24 hours. The location came through at 10:51, a private document storage facility 12 miles east, the kind of commercial building that warehoused corporate records and offered private conference rooms by the hour, frequented by lawyers and accountants, and nobody who would look twice at a group of people carrying file boxes. Valen's choice was smart. Unremarkable location, controlled access, no public-facing reason for anyone to be there. Cho drove. Ara sat in the passenger seat and watched the mirrors and said very little. The city moved past them in the particular way cities moved when you were inside something serious, the ordinary details sharpening and flattening simultaneously, the coffee shops and pedestrians and traffic signals all registering at the surface, while underneath everything your mind ran parallel calculations about distance and exposure and what happened if the next 5 minutes went wrong. They arrived at 11:19. Darian's car was already in the lot, a gray vehicle she didn't recognize, which meant Marcus had sourced it from somewhere other than the estate's registered vehicles. Smart. She noted it. She noted Darian standing beside it with a weathered leather satchel over one shoulder and Marcus 2 steps behind him scanning the lot with the patient, systematic attention of a man who had been doing this his entire professional life. Darian looked at her across the lot. She nodded once. He nodded back. They went inside. Ruth Valen was already in the conference room. She was 60 or close to it, with short silver hair and the kind of face that had been serious for so long it had settled into seriousness as a permanent condition. She wore a plain gray blazer and had a single closed laptop on the table in front of her and nothing else. No files. No recorder that Ara could see. No second person. Ms. Quinn, she said. Not a greeting. An acknowledgement. Ms. Valen. Mr. Voss. She looked at Darian. I know who you are. I've known about your file for 11 months. The room shifted slightly. Darian set the satchel on the table without sitting down. Then why didn't you reach out? Because reaching out to you would have required going through a channel I didn't trust, and I wasn't willing to burn what I'd built for 11 months to accelerate a timeline. She looked at him steadily. You understand that calculus. I understand it, he said. I don't entirely like it. You don't have to like it. She looked at Era. Sit down, all of you. We have approximately 2 hours before I need to move the information I'm about to share to a secure location, and I need you to hear all of it before I do that. They sat. Cho on one side, Darian and Marcus on the other, Era at the end nearest the door because old habits were structural at this point. Valen opened the laptop, turned it to face the room. On the screen was a document, a federal organizational chart, the kind produced internally, with names and reporting lines. Several boxes were highlighted in red. This is what I've built in 14 months, Valen said. The contamination inside federal law enforcement infrastructure that has protected Victor Crane's operation is not incidental. It's not a few bought officials. It is a deliberate, constructed network of compromised personnel placed across 4 agencies over a period of approximately 9 years. She let that land. 9 years of strategic placement. The Crane organization identified the agencies that would eventually have jurisdiction over their operations and spent nearly a decade putting people in place. No one spoke. The DOJ contact who suppressed Ms. Cho's case, Valan continued, pointing to a name on the chart, reports to a deputy director whose financial records show consistent offshore deposits beginning 7 years ago. The federal contractor shell company that ran surveillance on your estate, Mr. Voss, another name, another red box, is owned through 4 layers by a man who sits on a Homeland Security Advisory Board. She paused. And the federal agent who made initial contact with Ms. Quinn 4 years ago? Sandra Merritt, Ara said. Valan looked at her. Something in her expression changed, not softened, shifted. Sandra Merritt was not transferred, she said. The air in the room changed temperature. What? Ara said. She was not transferred. She was removed from contact with you specifically. Her reassignment was engineered by the same network. But Sandra Merritt continued working the Crane case independently for 8 months after losing contact with you. She built a significant secondary file. Valan paused. She was killed in what was documented as a traffic accident 26 months ago. Single vehicle, rural highway outside Fresno. Ara heard her own pulse. She had spent 4 years believing Sandra Merritt had been neutralized professionally, transferred, reassigned, rendered ineffective. She had grieved that in the particular muted way you grieve things you can't afford to fully feel, the way you file loss under pragmatic acceptance and keep moving. She had not known she was grieving a dead woman. How long have you known? Ara asked. Her voice came out wrong, too flat, the specific flatness of a person overriding something seismic. I confirmed it 7 months ago. The accident was staged. The driver of the vehicle that caused it was identified through traffic camera footage and traced to a logistics contractor with ties to the Crane network. 7 months, Ara said. Yes. And you didn't... She stopped, restarted. You knew there was a witness in hiding, and you knew the people hunting her had already killed the federal agent who'd made contact, and you sat on that for 7 months. You were building a case. The flatness was gone. While the people who killed Sandra Merritt were in my house, watching me sleep. She stood up. The chair scraped back hard. How many more people die while you build your case? Ara? Darian's voice. Not loud, just present. Don't. She looked at Valan. I need a minute. She walked to the corner of the room, not out the door, just away, just the 8 feet of distance the room allowed, and stood with her back to the table. She pressed her fingers against the wall's surface and breathed, in through the nose, out slow. The way she'd practiced, the way that wasn't wellness but survival mechanics. Sandra Merritt had kept going. After they'd taken her off the case, after they'd cut her contact with Ara, she had kept going for 8 months on her own, and they had killed her for it on a rural highway outside Fresno and called it an accident. 45 seconds in a hallway. That was what had started this. For Sandra Merritt, it had ended on a road in the dark. Ara turned back around. What do you need from us? She said. Not a question. A transaction. Valan had been waiting without expression. Mr. Voss's file. The original acquisition documents and movement records. Ms. Quinn's full testimony, recorded and sealed under my jurisdiction with a chain of custody that bypasses the DOJ entirely. And one more thing. She looked around the table. There's a warehouse facility registered to a Crane subsidiary 22 miles from this location. My surveillance indicates it has been the primary processing point for the documentation infrastructure supporting the trafficking network. Financial records, operational logs, personnel files. 14 months of evidence of Crane's organization's full scope. She paused. My intelligence from 3 days ago indicates the facility has begun shredding. They know something has shifted. Possibly the failed authentication attempt on your file, Mr. Voss, triggered a defensive protocol. How long before it's gone? Marcus asked. At the rate my surveillance logged, 48 to 72 hours from 3 days ago. Marcus did the math out loud. That's 12 to 36 hours from now. Approximately. Can you get a warrant and rate it? Cho asked. Any warrant application I file goes through a system with compromised nodes. By the time I have paper, they'll have ash. Valen closed the laptop. I need someone to go in before the warrant. Document what's there. Pull physical records if possible. Give me enough to establish the evidence existed so that destruction itself becomes an obstruction charge. The room was very quiet. That's not legal, Cho said. No, Valen agreed. It's not. You're asking civilians to conduct an unauthorized entry into a facility run by a criminal organization with federal protection on a 12-hour window to recover evidence for a case you can't officially advance through proper channels. Cho's voice was precise and controlled. That is what you're asking. I'm describing a situation, Valen said. I'm not asking anyone to do anything. Marcus was looking at Darian. Darian was looking at the middle of the table. Ara was looking at Valen. You've had eyes on this facility for 14 months, Ara said. You know the layout. I have floor plans. Shift rotations? Partial. My surveillance was external. How many personnel on site? Nighttime reduction to 4, 2 exterior, 2 interior. Cameras? 8 external. Interior unknown. Ara looked at Marcus. He was already running it. She could see it in his eyes, the same unfocused, internal calculation she'd watched him do in the kitchen that morning. It's manageable, he said. Quietly. Not enthusiastically, just honestly. I'm going, Ara said. Absolutely not, Darian said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with something she hadn't seen on his face before. Not calculation, not assessment. Something rawer than that. Something he was visibly working to keep at a functional level. It's my testimony that anchors the case, she said. If we go in there and pull records that corroborate what I heard in that hallway 4 years ago, the combination becomes irrefutable. But I need to know what we're corroborating. I need to see it. Marcus doesn't know what he's looking for. I do. She held his gaze. I heard names that night, specific names, transit routes, dates. I've carried them in my head for 4 years because there was nowhere else to put them. I go in, I can identify the relevant records in minutes. Without me, it's hours, and we don't have hours. Darian held her gaze for a long moment, the longest she'd seen from him. If something goes wrong in that building, he said, everything you've survived becomes worthless. If we don't go in that building, she said, everything Sandra Merritt died for becomes worthless. The name landed in the room like a stone into still water. Valen was watching her. Cho was watching her. Marcus had stopped calculating and was just watching her. Darian looked at the table, then back at her. We go tonight, he said. All of us. My conditions. What conditions? I go in with you, not Marcus leading, not me waiting in a car. I go in. Marcus started to object. Darian raised one hand and Marcus stopped. If Crane's people have federal coverage, Darian said, and if tonight goes wrong, I want to be in that building when it does. Not because I'm useful in a fight. Marcus is more useful than I am in a fight. But because if something happens to you in there and I'm sitting in a vehicle outside, I won't be able to live with the version of myself that made that choice. He said it without drama, without performance, just fact. Those are my conditions. Ara looked at him for a long moment. Fine, she said. Valen opened the laptop again, pulled up a floor plan, turned it to face them. Then let's talk about how you get in, she said. And outside, 22 miles away in a warehouse that smelled of diesel and shredded paper, a machine ran continuously, consuming the records of 9 years of human suffering one page at a time, while the clock on the wall marked the hours they had left to stop it. They spent 4 hours in that conference room. Valen walked them through the floor plan with the methodical patience of someone who had been sitting on this intelligence for 14 months and understood that the difference between useful information and wasted information was the quality of preparation applied to it. The warehouse was a single-story commercial structure, loading bays on the south face, office block on the north, a central processing area that Valen's external surveillance had identified as the shredding operations location based on power draw and waste container activity. Two exterior guards on a rotation that Valen's team had logged for 3 weeks. The rotation had a 7-minute gap on the northwest corner between passes. Not negligence, just geometry, the natural blind spot created by the building's L-shaped extension. 7 minutes was workable. Marcus said so without being asked, which meant he'd been calculating it before Valen finished the sentence. Interior layout was the unknown. Valen had partial schematics from the building's original commercial permit filing. Office rooms along the north wall, open floor plan in the center, electrical and utility along the east. What had been done to the interior since the Crane organization took occupancy 18 months ago was inference and educated guess. 2 interior personnel, Marcus said. Partial unknown on position. The power draw concentrates in the central area, Valen said. The shredding equipment runs continuously based on our thermal readings. At least one person managing the operation there. That pins one interior guard to the central floor. Marcus studied the plan. The second could be anywhere. Office block, most likely, Darian said. Everyone looked at him. If I'm running a document destruction operation under time pressure, I want someone managing the administrative side. What gets shredded in what order, what gets pulled for separate disposal. That's an office function. North wall. Valan looked at him with something that might have been reassessment. Consistent with our inference, yes. So we have a 7-minute window on the northwest corner, Marcus said. Entry through the utility access on the east face, furthest from both guard positions. We move through the east corridor, split at the central junction. I take the interior guard on the floor. Ara and Darian move to the document processing area and identify priority records. He looked at Ara. How long do you need? To identify? Minutes. To pull physical copies of what matters? She thought about the names she'd been carrying, the specific operational language Crane had used in that hallway, the transit route designations. 20 minutes if the records are organized, longer if they've already processed the relevant files. We won't know until we're in, Marcus said. No? She agreed. Cho had been quiet for the last hour. She spoke now. I want to be clear about what I can and cannot do with anything recovered tonight. Evidence obtained through unauthorized entry is inadmissible in standard proceedings. But evidence of destruction is its own charge, Darian said. If Valen can establish through her legitimate surveillance that records existed and were subsequently destroyed, yes. What you recover tonight gives her the specificity to do that. The file names, the record categories, the scope of what was being eliminated. Cho looked at Valen. You document what they find. Your surveillance corroborates the destruction timeline. The combination creates an obstruction case that doesn't depend on the recovered materials being entered as primary evidence. And my testimony, Ara said, which predates tonight and exists independently of anything we pull from that building. Your testimony is clean, Cho said. It always was. What tonight does is give it a corroborating architecture that makes it impossible to dismiss as a single witness account. They left the document facility at 3:15. Valen went separately. She had preparations of her own, notifications to make through the channels she trusted, positioning that needed to happen before midnight. Cho went back to her office to begin the formal documentation that would support the obstruction case. Marcus drove. Darian sat in the front passenger seat. Iara sat in the back and looked out the window at the city going about its afternoon and felt the specific unreality of moving through ordinary life while carrying something this heavy. They ate at a diner, Marcus's choice, Cash, a place with a parking lot that allowed clear sightlines in all directions. Nobody talked about what was coming. They talked about other things, or they didn't talk at all, and the not talking was more comfortable than it should have been between people who had known each other less than 24 hours in any meaningful sense. At one point, Darian looked at her across the table and said, "You cooked at a Michelin-starred restaurant before the catering company." She looked up. "How do you know that?" "Marcus's background research, before we hired you. That research was supposed to confirm I wasn't a liability. It confirmed more than that." He drank his coffee. "The chef at Renard said you were the best prep cook he'd had in a decade, and that you left without notice in the middle of a Saturday service." She set her fork down. "That was the week before everything happened." "I know." "Then why bring it up?" He thought about it for a moment. "Because I've been trying to understand for 8 months Why someone with that kind of skill was hiding in my kitchen making bread and asking for nothing. He said it without accusation, just the particular directness she'd come to recognize as his default mode of honesty. And now I understand. And I wanted you to know that I understood. She picked up her fork. The bread was good. The bread was excellent, he said, especially Tuesdays. It shouldn't have been funny. It was, slightly, just slightly. Marcus pretended not to notice, which was its own kind of courtesy. They were in position by 11:40. Marcus had sourced 2 vehicles, both unremarkable, both with clean plates, both parked on separate streets flanking the warehouse's north and east approaches. Reyes had driven out from the estate and was in the second vehicle covering the south exit, communicating through earpieces Marcus had pulled from a case in the estate's security room. The night was cold and clear. No wind. The warehouse sat in a light industrial block, the kind of area that was active during business hours and almost completely empty after dark, which was presumably why the crane organization had chosen it. Sodium lights on the corners of adjacent buildings threw flat orange pools across the asphalt. The warehouse itself was dark on the exterior except for a single white light above the south loading bay entrance. Ara could hear the shredding machine from 30 meters out, a low continuous mechanical grinding that was almost below the threshold of hearing. You felt it in your molars before you heard it with your ears. 22 miles from the conference room where Valen had laid out the floor plan and the clock had started running, the machine was still going. Northwest corner camera goes to a 12-second loop at 11:53, Marcus said quietly through the earpiece. Valen's team had handled the loop remotely, the one piece of technical support she'd been willing to provide. We have the 7-minute window starting at 11:54. We move at 54. Era checked her watch, 11:51. She looked at Darian beside her. He was focused on the building, his breathing controlled, his posture carrying none of the tension she'd have expected from someone who restructured companies for a living and was now crouched in the shadow of a wall outside a criminal organization's operational facility. He'd said in the diner, during the planning, that he'd spent time in environments more dangerous than this before his money was old enough to insulate him. She hadn't asked for specifics. She believed him. He felt her looking and glanced at her. "When we're inside," she said quietly, "you stay with me. Whatever you see, whatever happens, you stay with me, and you don't move independently." Agreed. If Marcus calls abort, we abort. No debate. Agreed. If I find the records I need and I tell you to take them and go, you go without waiting for me. He looked at her for a moment. That one I'll agree to if you tell me you intend to follow immediately behind. I intend to follow immediately behind. Then agreed. 11:53. The exterior guard completed his pass on the northwest corner at 11:53 and 40 seconds. They tracked him through Reyes's sightline from the south position. He moved east along the building face, unhurried, a man doing a routine job on a quiet night with no reason to expect otherwise. "Moving," Marcus said at 54 exactly. They went in 3. Marcus first, Ara second, Darian behind her, across the open ground between their position and the utility access door on the east face. 22 meters of open asphalt. Ara counted her steps without deciding to. Old reflex. Her boots were quiet on the surface, and her breath was steady, and the cold air was sharp enough that she could feel her heartbeat in her temples. Marcus reached the door. He had the access override Valen's team had prepared, a small device that interfaced with the electronic lock, a bypass that Valen had described as borrowed from a toolkit she officially didn't possess. It took 4 seconds. The lock disengaged with a sound like a single soft exhale. They were inside. The east corridor was dark, except for the glow of emergency lighting strips along the floor, dim green lines running toward the central junction. The mechanical grinding was louder in here, a constant industrial pulse that ran through the floor and up through the soles of Ara's boots. The smell hit her immediately. Hot paper, machine oil, the particular acrid scent of electronics running hot, the smell of documents being destroyed at volume. Marcus signaled at the corridor junction, left for the central floor, right for the office block. He looked at Ara. She pointed right. He shook his head. Left first, interior guard first, then right. Standard sequence. She nodded. Marcus went left. She and Darian held at the junction for 90 seconds, The longest 90 seconds she'd experienced since the night she'd kept driving for 9 hours. And then Marcus's voice came through the earpiece, low and controlled. "One down. Central floor is clear. Move right." She didn't let herself think about what one down meant in operational terms. She moved. The office block on the north wall was 3 rooms separated by interior glass partitions, the kind of layout that had been a standard open-plan office configuration before the Crane organization moved in and converted it. The glass had been covered with paper on the inside, which told her they'd been working here long enough to care about visual privacy, even in a facility no one was supposed to know existed. The second interior guard was in the middle room. He heard them before they reached the door. Some small sound, the compression of flooring, the shift of air in a space accustomed to 2 inhabitants, and he was on his feet when Marcus came through the door 4 seconds ahead of Ara and Darian. What followed was brief and close and ugly in the way that real physical confrontation was always ugly, nothing like choreographed, everything happening in the compressed space between 1 second and the next. The guard was large and reactive, and Marcus was neither of those things. Marcus was precise, and precise won. Ara was already past them and into the room before it finished. The records were there. Filing cabinets, 4 of them, standard commercial grade, all open, all partially emptied, the pulled files stacked in wheeled bins that had been run out to the central floor for destruction. But the cabinets still held material, alphabetical, organized by what appeared to be operational code designations rather than names. She recognized the system immediately, recognized it because the designation structure Crane had used in the hallway that night 4 years ago had the same pattern. 2 letters, 4 numbers, operational identifiers. "Here," she said, not loud, controlled. Darian was beside her. "What am I looking for?" 2 letters, 4 numbers. TL series and RK series specifically. She was already moving through the first cabinet, her fingers reading tabs in the dim light. TL is transit logistics, movement records for the trafficking operations. RK is something else. I heard it used in context that suggested financial relay, money movement correlated to victim transfers. "How do you remember this after 4 years?" "I've had nothing else to think about for 4 years. She found the first TL file at the back of cabinet 2. Thick, 2 inches of documents, paper-clipped in sections, handwritten notations and margins that she couldn't read in this light, but that existed, that were physical and present, and had not yet been fed to the machine on the central floor. She pulled it and handed it to Darian without looking up and kept moving. "We need a bag," she said. Darian pulled off his jacket, spread it on the desk surface, began stacking files on it as she handed them back. She found 4 more TL files, 2 RK files. And then, in the bottom drawer of cabinet 4, something she hadn't expected, a file with no code designation at all. Just a name, handwritten on the tab in capital letters. Merritt. Her hand stopped moving. She stood there for a moment with the drawer open and her fingers on the tab and the grinding of the shredding machine coming through the floor, and Darian somewhere behind her and Marcus by the door, and all of it receded to a background frequency while she looked at Sandra Merritt's name written on a file tab in a criminal organization's operational records. She pulled it. She opened it standing there in the dim office with the emergency strip lighting throwing green shadows across the pages. It was a thin file, 8 pages, maybe 10. She couldn't read the full content in this light, but she caught enough. Surveillance photographs. A timeline. A notation in the same handwriting as the tab, halfway down the first page, that contained a date 26 months ago and a location and 2 words that confirmed everything Valen had told her in the conference room. She closed the file. She put it inside her shirt against her chest and held it there with her forearm pressed flat against her ribs. "Ara," Darian's voice. "We're at 12 minutes. "I know." Marcus says, "I know." She pulled 2 more files from the bottom drawer without looking at the tabs and added them to the pile on his jacket. "Wrap it. Let's move." Darian wrapped the files in his jacket and held the bundle against his chest. They came back through the office doorway. Marcus was already at the corridor junction, watching both directions, the controlled stillness of a man who was counting seconds in his head with the same precision a metronome counted beats. Clear, Marcus said. We have 90 seconds on the exterior rotation. They moved back down the east corridor toward the utility door. Ara's boots on the floor, the grinding of the machine at her back, the file flat against her ribs with Sandra Merritt's name pressed against her sternum. 40 meters, 30, 20. The utility door. Marcus hit it. Cold air, asphalt, the flat orange sodium light and the quiet industrial street and the unremarkable night that had no idea what had just happened inside that building. They were 10 meters from the door when the alarm went off. Not a subtle alarm. A full facility klaxon, the kind that suggested something beyond the access loop Valen's team had covered, a secondary system that nobody had accounted for. Triggered by what Ara didn't know, motion sensor or pressure plate, or a dead man's switch tied to the interior guard's communication device, it didn't matter what. It was going. Run, Marcus said. Unnecessary. They were already running. The exterior guard on the south rotation appeared at the building's corner 40 meters to their left. She saw him in her peripheral vision as she ran, saw him see them, saw him reach for his radio. Reyes's voice came through the earpiece from the south vehicle. I have him. Keep moving. They hit the east vehicle at a sprint. Marcus behind the wheel before the doors were fully closed, the engine running before Darian's door latched, the vehicle moving before Ara had her breath back. She pressed herself into the seat and held the files in Darian's jacket against her chest, with both arms crossed over them, and felt her heart hitting the inside of her ribs like it was trying to get out. Reyes, Marcus said. Mobile. South Guard is on radio, but I cut his line of sight. He doesn't have plates. Second vehicle? Running parallel, 2 blocks east. Valen. A pause. A longer pause than any of them wanted. Then Valen's voice through the channel, not the earpiece, through Marcus's phone on the dash, speaker, the voice compressed and slightly distorted. I have a problem, she said. Marcus's jaw tightened. Define problem. My contact inside the enforcement network, the one I've trusted for 14 months. Another pause. She's not answering. Her secure channel went dark 40 minutes ago. The vehicle kept moving through the empty streets. Ara stared at the back of Marcus's headrest and felt the weight of the Merritt file against her ribs and thought about the specific geometry of betrayal, how it was always the thing you'd built your entire strategy around, the person you'd decided to trust after 14 months of careful evaluation. That turned out to be the load-bearing wall that wasn't load-bearing at all. Is she compromised or is she dead? Darian asked. I don't know yet, Valen said. What do you know? A beat. I know that 40 minutes ago, someone accessed the secure evidence relay I set up for tonight's operation. Someone who had my channel credentials. Ara closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. They know we went in, she said. Yes. They know what we took. Possibly. And if your contact was the leak, they've known about tonight since the meeting at the document facility. Silence on the line. Valan, Ara said. If they knew about tonight since the meeting, they let us go in. Another silence, longer. They let you go in, Valen said slowly, and they let you come out. Because they want the files, Darian said. His voice was very controlled. Not destroyed, recovered. If they raid us before we can transfer the records to a secure location, they get everything back and we become the people who broke into their facility. And my testimony becomes the account of someone who participated in a criminal break-in, Ara said, which Crane's lawyers used to destroy my credibility. The vehicle moved through the dark city and nobody spoke for a long moment, and the alarm they'd left behind them was inaudible now. But Ara could still feel it in her back teeth, the phantom resonance of a klaxon that had not been an accident and had not been a failure of preparation, but had been, she was now certain, a signal sent deliberately to a receiving party that was already waiting to hear it. They're going to intercept us, Marcus said. Flat. Certain. Before we reach Cho, Darian said. Before we reach anyone. Ara uncrossed her arms from the jacket bundle in her lap. She looked at the files, the TL series, the RK series, the Merritt file pressed against the fabric. Everything Sandra Merritt had died to prevent from being destroyed. And everything Crane's people now needed to recover to finish the job she'd started. She looked at Darian. He was already looking at her. New plan, she said. I'm listening, he said. And 3 blocks ahead, at the intersection they were approaching at 40 miles an hour, a black SUV pulled slowly out of a side street and stopped perpendicular across both lanes, its headlights off, its engine running, blocking the road with the specific, deliberate patience of people who had known exactly where they'd be. Marcus didn't brake. He accelerated. Ara felt the seat press into her back as the vehicle surged forward toward the blocked intersection, and she understood what he was doing a half-second before it happened. Not ramming the SUV, angling left, toward the gap between the SUV's front bumper and the curb, a gap that was maybe 4 feet wide and looked like nothing. And Marcus threaded it at 43 miles an hour with 2 inches to spare on each side, and the sound of the side mirror taking off the SUV's door handle like a rifle shot. Then they were through and moving, and the SUV was behind them. They'll follow, Darian said. They're already following, Marcus said. He took a right without slowing, then a left. Then through a service alley that Ara didn't see until they were in it, narrow brick walls on both sides, dumpsters blurring past. Reyes, what's your position? 4 blocks north, I see the tail. Black SUV, 1 vehicle. You have a second one, Marcus. White panel van, 2 blocks west, running parallel. They boxed the route, Darian said. They boxed the route we were supposed to take, Marcus said. We're not on that route. Where are we going? Marcus didn't answer. He came out of the alley onto a wider street, ran a red light at a junction with no cross traffic, took a left that pressed everyone sideways against their doors, and then his phone rang through the dash speaker. Not Valen's line, a different number, one Ara didn't recognize. Don't answer that, she said. I know who it is, Marcus said. He answered it. The voice on the other end was male, measured, with the specific quality of calm that belonged to people who used calm as a form of violence. Mr. Priel, I think we can resolve this without anyone getting hurt. Marcus said nothing. He kept driving. The materials your party recovered from the facility tonight need to be returned. That's all. Return the materials, walk away, and this ends here. Miss Quinn continues her life undisturbed. Mr. Voss continues his business undisturbed. No further action is taken. Ara leaned toward the phone. Who am I talking to? A pause. Then, you know who you're talking to, Ms. Quinn, or should I say Ms. Park, or is it still Eleanor these days? Victor Crane's voice was exactly as she'd remembered it from the hallway 4 years ago. She had replayed those 45 seconds so many times in 4 years that she'd been afraid the memory had distorted, that she'd constructed something more monstrous than reality to justify what her life had become. It hadn't distorted. The voice was exactly this, reasonable even, carrying the absolute assurance of a man who had never once faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way around. The materials aren't coming back, she said. Ms. Quinn. My name, she said, is Ara Quinn. It's the only name I'm going to use from this point forward, and the next time you use any other name for me will be the last conversation we have. Are we clear? A silence. Not long, 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, she felt Darian look at her from the passenger seat, and she didn't look back, but she felt it. You're making a mistake, Crane said. I've made a lot of mistakes, she said. Staying quiet for 4 years was one of them. I'm done making that particular one. She reached across and ended the call. Marcus's phone immediately rang again. He declined it. It rang again. He turned the phone off. Reyes, he said through the earpiece. I need the second vehicle at the river crossing on Hammond. 5 minutes. Moving, Reyes said. What's at Hammond? Darian asked. A federal building, Marcus said. Specifically, the regional office of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which operates separately from the DOJ. He glanced in the mirror, which was Valen's own suggestion for emergency evidence deposit before her contact went dark. She gave me the address and the after-hours security protocol during the planning session at the document facility. I didn't mention it to the group because I don't share contingency plans with groups. Ara looked at the back of his head. You didn't trust everyone in that room. I trusted everyone in that room to be who they said they were, Marcus said. I didn't trust that no one in that room had been followed, surveilled, or compromised before they arrived. Those are different things. The white panel van reappeared in the mirror, 3 blocks back, moving fast. They're running out of time too, Darian said. Whatever they planned for this interception, they planned for a quieter part of the city. We're heading toward the financial district, which has more traffic cameras, Marcus said. More witnesses. More everything they don't want. The panel van accelerated. Marcus accelerated. The black SUV had fallen behind. The alley maneuver had put distance on it that a larger vehicle couldn't make up quickly. The panel van was faster, more maneuverable, and it was closing. Reyes's voice. Hammond crossing in 90 seconds. I'm positioned. What do you need? Block the van when we pass, Marcus said. Don't engage. Just block. Understood. They came onto Hammond at speed. Ara saw the second vehicle, Reyes's car sitting at the curb on the east side of the crossing, and saw Reyes pull out smoothly into the lane behind them as they passed, positioning between their vehicle and the approaching van with the unhurried precision of someone executing a plan she'd already run through her head 3 times. The van's brake lights flared. It couldn't go around without going onto the sidewalk. It went onto the sidewalk. She's not stopping, Reyes said through the earpiece, her voice carrying a thread of something that wasn't alarm but was adjacent to it. How far are we? Marcus said. 40 seconds. The federal building came up on the right. Gray stone, broad steps, the kind of architecture that communicated institutional permanence whether it had earned it or not. The lights in the lobby were on, after-hours security visible through the glass. Marcus stopped the car at the curb. Out. Now. Take the files. Go through the front entrance and do not stop. Ara grabbed the jacketed bundle. Darian was already out of the vehicle. She came around the car and they moved up the steps together. Not running, not because she didn't want to run, but because running at the entrance of a federal building after midnight was a different kind of problem. And behind her she heard tires, and she heard Marcus's voice on the earpiece saying something to Reyes, and she pushed through the glass door and the lobby air hit her, warm and overlit and smelling of industrial cleaning fluid, and the security guard behind the desk was already standing. Ma'am? My name is Era Quinn, she said. I have physical documentary evidence related to an active financial crimes enforcement network investigation. I need to speak to the duty officer, right now. The guard looked at her, looked at Darian behind her, looked at the jacket bundle she was holding against her chest, looked at whatever was on her face, the specific combination of exhaustion and absolute seriousness that she suspected was beyond her ability to moderate at this point. He picked up the phone. What followed was 31 minutes of controlled institutional chaos, the kind generated when a government building's after-hours protocol encounters something it wasn't specifically designed for. The duty officer came down, then a supervisor, then a woman in a blazer over a sweater who introduced herself as Deputy Director Cassian Holt, and who had clearly been called in from somewhere else because her hair was not entirely dry, and her blazer had been put on in a hurry. Holt looked at the files. She looked at Ara. She picked up her own phone and made a call that she took in the corridor, and when she came back, her expression had shifted into something Ara recognized. The specific look of someone who has just had a suspicion confirmed that they'd been carrying for a long time. Ruth Vallon, Holt said. You were at her meeting today. Yes. Vallon has been operating a parallel investigation that my office has been aware of in outline only for approximately 8 months. Holt looked at the files again. She came to me 6 weeks ago and asked me to be available for an emergency evidence deposit. She didn't give me specifics. Is she safe? Era asked. I don't know yet. I have people trying to locate her. Holt set the files on the table between them. I need you to walk me through everything, from the beginning, and I need it on record. Ara looked at the files on the table, the TL series, the RK series, the Merritt file still pressed against the fabric of Darian's jacket, Sandra Merritt's name written in the handwriting of the people who had arranged her death. From the beginning, she said. All right. It took 4 hours. She talked until 4:50 in the morning, seated at a conference table on the 6th floor with a recorder running and Holt across from her, and 2 analysts taking notes. Darian sat against the wall throughout. She'd asked him to stay and Holt had permitted it. Not participating, not interjecting, just present in the way that a fixed point is present. Something to orient by. She told it all. The catering event, the hallway, the 45 seconds, Crane's voice and Holtz's name, and the specific transit route designations that matched the TL files on the table. The Sacramento diner and Sandra Merritt and the 9-hour drive. 4 years of cities and names, and the particular texture of a fear that had become so constant it had stopped feeling like fear and started feeling like weather. She told them about the lamp in her room, about the file with Merritt's name on the tab. She slid it across the table and watched Holt open it and watched Holt's face do something careful and controlled when she reached the notation with the date and location. "This is a record of a sanctioned killing," Holt said, quietly. "Yes." "Kept on file by the organization that ordered it." "The arrogance of people who believe they're untouchable," Ara said. "They kept records of everything. That's what happens when you have enough federal coverage. You stop believing anyone can ever use the records against you." Holt closed the file. She looked at Ara for a long moment. "Ms. Quinn, the contact inside Valan's network who went dark tonight, we've located her. She's alive. She wasn't the leak." Ara felt something release in her chest. Then who was? "We think the channel itself was compromised, not the person. Crane's technical operation broke the encryption on Valan's secure relay 3 days ago. They've been reading her communications since then." Holt paused. "Which means they knew about the meeting. They let it happen. They planned to intercept the materials afterward before any official deposit could be made. And when we came here instead of the route they'd covered, they lost the window." Holt's expression was not quite satisfaction. It was the professional equivalent of it, the recognition of a calculus that had finally resolved in the right direction. "Mr. Crane has been contacted by our field team in the last 20 minutes. He is currently in federal custody pending formal charges." The room was very quiet. Ara sat with that sentence for a moment. She turned it over. She examined it the way you examined something you'd stopped letting yourself want because the wanting had been too expensive for too long. Carefully, at a slight distance, not quite trusting that it was real and solid and not going to dissolve. "Desmond Holtz," she said. "He disappeared 4 years ago. We've had a file on Holtz for some time. We'll be reopening it with the new corroborating material." Holt looked at her steadily. "It may take time." "I've been patient for 4 years," Ara said. "I know how to wait." She was cleared to leave at 5:23 in the morning. Darian was waiting in the corridor. He looked at her as she came through the door, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there wasn't a sentence that fit the particular shape of what the last 24 hours had been, and they both seemed to understand that simultaneously. "Marcus?" she asked. "Outside. He and Reyes are both fine. The van backed off when we went into the building." He paused. Valan called. "She's safe. She went dark deliberately when she realized her channel had been breached. She's been in a secure location since midnight running her own parallel documentation." "Of course she has," Ara said. It came out with something that wasn't quite a laugh, but was related to one. They went downstairs. The lobby was gray in the early light coming through the glass, the city outside beginning its slow return to activity, the first suggestion of morning in the eastern sky above the buildings. Marcus was on the steps, his jacket collar up against the cold, looking out at the street with the alert stillness that she suspected never fully left him, regardless of context. He turned when he heard them. He looked at her face. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. He nodded once. That was all. It was enough. Reyes brought the car around and they drove back through the city in the early morning. Nobody talked. The silence was different from the silence of the drive out. That one had been loaded, coiled, full of what was coming. This one had weight of a different kind. The weight of something that had been carried for a long time and had finally been set down. And the particular physical adjustment required when something you've been bracing against for years suddenly isn't there anymore. Ara watched the city move past the window. Coffee shops opening their gates. A delivery truck double-parked on a side street. A woman walking a dog on an empty sidewalk. The dog investigating something in the gutter with the full dedication that dogs brought to small investigations. Ordinary. Completely unremarkably ordinary. The city had no idea what had happened inside it overnight and went about its morning with the cheerful indifference of cities everywhere. She had forgotten what ordinary looked like when you watched it without calculating your position relative to the exits. They reached the estate at 6:40. The cedar trees were dark green in the early light, wet with overnight dew, the smell of them cutting through the vehicle's interior the moment Marcus turned off the access road. The estate itself sat quiet and unchanged. The same 43 acres, the same gravel perimeter road, the same gray stone of the main building in the pale morning. She had left it less than 24 hours ago, walking through those trees with wet boots and a folded piece of paper and the specific grim determination of a person who had run out of road. She came back through the front entrance in a car that smelled of cold air and exhaust, and the residual tension of a night that had taken years of accumulated pressure and finally, violently, resolved it. The kitchen was exactly as she'd left it. She stood in the doorway for a moment. The same island, the same copper pots on the hooks above the range. The reading lamp that now had a hollow base sat on the counter where Reyes had left it, no longer her problem, no longer anyone's problem. She'd buy a new lamp, a different one. That was a small decision, and she was aware that she was fixating on it because the larger ones were still too large to look at directly. She filled the kettle, put it on the range. It was a thing to do with her hands that was not running or planning or calculating how many minutes she had before a situation changed. It was just a kettle and a flame and the sound of water beginning to move. Darian came into the kitchen behind her. He didn't say anything. He sat at the island, not his usual position at the far end, but closer. And she was aware of that shift in the same peripheral way she'd been aware of things about him for 8 months while pretending she wasn't. "What happens now?" he said. Not to prompt her, just the question that needed to be in the room. Holt's office files the formal charges. The TL and RK records get processed through Valon's investigation track. My testimony gets entered into the official file. She poured the tea, set a mug on the island without asking if he wanted it. It'll take months, probably longer. There are appeals processes and legal maneuvers, and Crane has 30 lawyers, and they'll use all of them. But he's in custody. He's in custody. She wrapped both hands around her own mug, which means for the first time in 4 years the equation has changed. He's not hunting me anymore. He's defending himself. And the compromised officials. Holt's office is already pulling the financial records on the names in the chart Valon built. The offshore deposits, the contractor connections. They'll fall in sequence. These things always do once the first piece is established and verifiable. She looked at the surface of her tea. Sandra Merritt's file goes into the official record. What happened to her gets formally established. That's not justice exactly, but it's something. Darian held his mug and didn't speak for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the cedar trees caught the first real light of morning. Not the flat pre-dawn gray, but actual gold, the kind that changed the texture of everything it touched. "You could leave," he said finally. "Now that it's safe, you could go anywhere." "I know." "I'm not suggesting you should. I'm saying the option exists for the first time." She looked at him. He was looking at his mug, not at her, which she understood was intentional, giving her the space to answer honestly without the pressure of being watched. "The garden's on the east side of the property," she said. He looked up. "I walked through them my first week here. They've been neglected. I don't think anyone's touched them in at least 2 seasons. There's a kitchen garden structure there that could be productive. Herbs, some vegetables, the kind of thing that makes a difference in daily cooking." She kept her voice even. "I've been thinking about it for months, but I didn't start anything because starting something means planning to still be here when it matures, and I hadn't let myself do that kind of planning." He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression. Not sentimentality. He wasn't built for sentimentality, and she wasn't asking him to be. Something quieter than that. Something that had the texture of a decision being made and settled. "I'll have the east garden beds cleared by the end of the week," he said. "I'll need good soil amended in. The beds have been sitting without compost. I'll have it arranged." She nodded. She drank her tea. That was all. That was enough. 3 days later, Ruth Valon appeared at the estate with 2 colleagues from her office and spent 6 hours formally processing the physical evidence under chain of custody documentation. She was methodical and thorough, and she looked, for the first time since Ara had met her, like someone who was doing the thing she'd been working toward for 14 months and had stopped bracing for it to be taken away. Before she left, she stopped in the kitchen doorway. "Sandra Merritt's family," she said. "She has a sister in Portland. The sister was told it was an accident." She paused. "When the formal file establishes what happened, the sister will be notified. I thought you'd want to know." Ara stood at the range with a pot she'd been stirring. She kept stirring it. "Thank you," she said. "She kept going after they removed her from the case," Valen said. 8 months on her own. That's worth something." "It's worth a great deal," Ara said. Valen left. The estate went quiet again. 2 weeks after that, the first formal indictments came down. Victor Crane on 14 counts, with additional charges pending related to the Merritt file. 3 DOJ officials suspended pending investigation. The deputy director with the offshore deposits placed on administrative leave and subsequently arrested. The Homeland Security Advisory Board member whose name appeared in the contractor documentation quietly resigned and was taken into custody at an airport 3 days later, attempting to board a private flight. The news cycle ran it for 4 days and moved on to something else. The way news cycles did. The compressed attention of the world flowing past events that had taken years to construct and minutes to report. Ara read the coverage on a tablet at the kitchen island one morning and then set the tablet down and went back to the bread she'd been making. The bread was good. It had been good lately. She'd adjusted the fermentation time and the result was a crust with more character than before. Slightly irregular, honest about what it was rather than trying to be something polished. She'd been thinking about bread differently lately, about food in general, about making things that had integrity in their imperfection rather than performing a kind of smoothness that didn't belong to them. The East Garden was cleared by the end of the first week, as promised. She went out early on the first real morning of the work, in old clothes with a pair of gloves she'd found in the utility room, and stood at the edge of the bed looking at the turned earth and the structure of what had been there before it was neglected. The bones of it were good. Someone had laid it out thoughtfully, a long time ago. It had just been left without tending for long enough that it looked like nothing. She knew something about that. She started with the herb section, closest to the kitchen, practical, immediate. Rosemary and thyme first because they were hardy and could anchor the bed while she worked on the more demanding things. She worked for 2 hours the first morning, and her hands were filthy by the end of it and her knees ached from the ground, and she was more present in her own body than she'd been in 4 years. Not in the way that fear made you present, that hyper-aware scanning state that she'd been living in so long she'd stopped recognizing it, but the other kind, the ordinary kind. Hands in dirt, knees on ground, the smell of turned earth and rosemary and cold morning air. Marcus found her there on the 3rd morning, coming around the corner of the east wing on his perimeter check. He stopped, looked at what she'd done, the cleared beds, the first herbs in the ground, the stakes she'd set for the climbing structure on the south wall. "You know how to do that," he said. "My grandmother taught me," she said without looking up. "Before everything else." He stood there for a moment. "It's going to be a good garden." "Eventually," she said. "It'll take time." He made a sound that might have been agreement and continued his perimeter check, and she went back to the work, and the morning light moved across the garden bed in the way that morning light did when you let yourself notice it. Darian came out that evening. She was finishing for the day, pulling her gloves off and looking at the progress with the particular assessment of someone planning the next stage of a long project. She heard him on the gravel path before she saw him. She still heard things before she saw them. She suspected she always would. That particular calibration wasn't going to undo itself. And she turned. He stood at the edge of the garden with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at what she'd done. He looked at it for a while. Then he looked at her. "The rosemary will take," he said. "It usually does," she said. "It's difficult to kill if you give it decent drainage." "Like certain people." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the directness that was simply how he operated, not performing candor, just incapable of the alternative. "I'm staying," she said. Not because he'd asked, because it needed to be said plainly, between two people who communicated plainly or not at all. Not because it's the safest option or the most practical one, or because I have nowhere else to go. I have options now. I'm choosing this one. He held her gaze. Why? She looked at the garden, at the turned beds and the first herbs and the climbing structure waiting for something to grow across it. At the 43 acres that had been, for 8 months, the closest thing to home she'd had in 4 years, and that she'd been too afraid to call that, and was done being too afraid. Because I started something here, she said, and I want to see it through. He stood there for a moment longer. Then he took his hands out of his jacket pockets and nodded once. Not the nod of someone agreeing to an arrangement, but the nod of someone who recognizes something true when they hear it and doesn't need to make more of it than it is. Tuesday's bread, he said. What about it? The fermentation change. I noticed. It's better. She put her gloves in her back pocket. I know, she said. I've been working on it. She walked back toward the house along the gravel path, past the cedar trees that were losing their light as the evening came in, and she did not look back over her shoulder once, not because she was certain there was nothing to look for, not because 4 years of damage had simply reversed itself overnight, but because looking back was a different thing now. No longer surveillance, no longer the maintenance of fear, just a life behind her, and a garden to tend, and the particular quiet of a person who has been running for a very long time and has finally, on her own terms, decided to stop. The formal hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday. Ara found out through Cho, who called the estate's landline at 7 in the morning 3 weeks after the indictments, and told her in the precise, unhurried voice of someone delivering information they'd been preparing to deliver carefully. The federal proceeding would require her testimony in person. Sealed session, restricted attendance, the specific protections afforded to material witnesses in organized crime cases. It would happen in 30 days. Are you ready for that? Cho asked. Ara was standing at the kitchen window watching the east garden in the early light. The rosemary had taken, as predicted. The time was coming in slower, but it was coming. She'd put in a row of parsley the week before along the south edge, and it was showing the first pale green of new growth. Yes, she said, it will be difficult. I know what it will be. A pause. I'll be with you in the room. That's already arranged. I know, Cho. Thank you. She hung up and stood at the window a while longer, 30 days. She'd been carrying the weight of that hallway for 4 years, and she was about to set it down in a room with recorders and attorneys and a sealed federal transcript that would exist for as long as institutions kept records. She ran through it in her head the way she'd been running through it since the morning after the warehouse. Not to rehearse, not to perform, but to make sure it was still intact. Every word, every name. The specific timbre of Crane's voice giving a directive to a man who was subsequently disappeared. It was all still there. Every syllable of 45 seconds. She made breakfast and didn't think about it anymore that morning. The hearing came on a gray Wednesday, overcast and cold, the kind of day that made the city look like a pencil drawing of itself. Cho met her outside the federal building, a different one from the building they'd entered in the dark 3 weeks ago, this one formal and deliberate in its architecture. Marcus drove her. Darian had offered to come and she'd told him no, this particular thing she needed to walk into under her own weight, and he'd accepted that without argument, which she had come to understand was one of the more significant things about him. She sat in the sealed room for 3 hours and 40 minutes, and she said every word she had been holding for 4 years, and she said them clearly and without hedging and without the careful omissions that 4 years of survival had trained her into. She said Crane's name. She said Holtz's name. She gave the transit route designations and the dates and the specific language used in a hallway at a private venue on a night that had ended one version of her life and quietly, without announcement, begun another. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. The lead federal attorney across the table looked at her with the expression of someone who had just received something they'd been trying to obtain for a long time through channels that kept failing. He said, "Thank you, Ms. Quinn." Just that. She nodded. She stood up. Her legs were steady. Cho walked out with her into the corridor afterward, and they stood by the window that overlooked the street below. Pedestrians, a food cart, a woman arguing on a phone with the focused irritation of someone losing a small battle. And Cho said nothing for a moment, and Ara said nothing, and it was the right kind of nothing. Sandra Merritt's sister was notified last week, Cho said finally. Officially, The cause of death reclassified. I know, Valen told me. There'll be a civil proceeding eventually, wrongful death. The sister may want to speak with you at some point as the witness who knew Sandra's work. If she wants to, I'm available, Ara said. She deserves to know her sister didn't stop. Cho looked at her. Neither did you. Ara watched the woman on the phone below win whatever argument she'd been having. The posture shifted, the phone came down. She walked on with the efficient satisfaction of small victories. Ordinary street. Ordinary afternoon. I stopped plenty of times, Ara said. I just kept starting again. Marcus was waiting at the curb. He held the door and she got in and he drove and the city moved past, and she let herself be moved through it without scanning every vehicle, every doorway, every face on the sidewalk. She didn't manage it perfectly. She probably never would. But she managed it more than she hadn't, which was progress of the kind that didn't announce itself. She was back at the estate by 4. The kitchen was warm. Someone had left the range on low, which meant Darian had been in here and had anticipated her return in the specific wordless way he'd developed of doing things that mattered without making them into occasions. She stood at the island for a moment with her coat still on and felt the particular quality of the house around her. Its weight, its consistency, the 43 acres outside holding the same cedar trees they'd always held, indifferent to everything that had happened within and around them. She took her coat off. She started dinner. She was halfway through reducing a pan sauce when she heard him on the stairs. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her at the range, and she didn't turn around. How was it? He said. Done, she said. It's done. He came to the island and sat. She kept working. The sauce reduced and the smell of it filled the kitchen, and outside the window the last of the afternoon light was leaving the cedar trees. Crane's lead attorney filed for a procedural delay this afternoon, he said. Holt's office rejected it within the hour. Good. The deputy director accepted a plea arrangement. His testimony goes into the record next week. Names of every official he personally compromised over 9 years. How many? 11 confirmed, possibly more. She stirred the sauce. 9 years of placing people. Like setting a table for a dinner no one else knew was being planned. It only works until someone refuses to sit down, he said. She turned from the range and looked at him across the kitchen. He was watching her with the steadiness that was simply his nature. Not performing calm, not managing her, just present and direct in the way that had unsettled her 8 months ago when she'd first come to work here and had come to mean something else entirely in the months since. I want to expand the kitchen garden in spring, she said. The east beds can take more than herbs. Tomatoes along the south wall, the sun exposure is good there. Some climbing beans on the structure. I'll have additional soil brought in. And I want to fix the irrigation line on the north side. It's been leaking since I found it, which is probably why the previous plantings failed. I'll get someone to look at it. I can look at it myself. I just need the parts. He looked at her for a moment. I'll get you the parts. She turned back to the range. The sauce was ready. She pulled it and set it aside and began plating without hurry, the way she cooked when there was no deadline and no performance and no one to impress, just the work itself done as well as it could be done because that was the only way she knew to do it. She set a plate on the island in front of him. He looked at it, then at her. You don't have to do this, he said. Cook for me. It doesn't have to be the arrangement anymore if you don't want it to be. I know it doesn't, she said. She sat across from him with her own plate. I want to cook. I've always wanted to cook. It's the one thing that was mine across every city, every name, every version of the last 4 years. She picked up her fork. It's not the arrangement. It's just who I am. He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up his fork. They ate. Outside, the night came in across the cedar trees and the 43 acres settled into its quiet, and the garden on the east side sat dark and patient in the way that gardens were, holding what had been planted, waiting on the season. The rosemary was in the ground, and the time was coming, and the climbing structure stood against the south wall, waiting for something to grow across it. And in the spring there would be tomatoes and beans, and the irrigation line would be fixed, and the beds would be properly amended. And all of it would take time, and none of it would be fast, and that was exactly as it should be. Era Quinn had spent 4 years running from a life that had been taken from her. She was done running. Not because the fear was gone. She knew better than to wait for that. Not because everything was resolved and clean and finished. The legal proceedings would take months, and Holtz was still missing, and Sandra Merritt's sister in Portland deserved more than a reclassified death certificate. And the world that had allowed Crane's network to exist for 9 years didn't dismantle itself in 30 days. She was done running because she had chosen to stop. That was all. That was everything. She washed the dishes after dinner. She dried them and put them where they went and hung the towel on its hook and turned off the kitchen light. She walked through the quiet house and up the stairs to her room, where a new lamp sat on the table by the window. Plain, inexpensive, entirely her own, and sat in its light for a while with a book she'd been trying to finish for 3 weeks. She read 4 pages, and then she set the book down and sat in the quiet and let herself be still. For the first time in 4 years, still did not feel like a target. It felt like something she had earned.